Time is running out for TikTok. Not really. U.S. President Donald Trump just signed an executive order giving TikTok another 75 days to find a non-Chinese owner. The video sharing app was facing a shutdown in the U.S. by Saturday morning. Last year, Congress ordered TikTok to split from its Chinese owner, ByteDance. Now, that was over national security fears and widespread belief in Washington that TikTok is ultimately controlled by the Chinese government. The clock began ticking on the 19th of January, leading to a short TikTok shutdown. But U.S. President Donald Trump signed a first executive order granting a 75-day reprieve to TikTok just 2 days after he took office. And now he's extended that reprieve by another 75 days. He's always said that he's confident that a buyer can be found for the app's U.S. business. On Thursday, the president also suggested that TikTok could even be part of a broader deal with China following those new tariffs that he announced this week. Here's Trump speaking on Air Force One.
You open to deals with these countries if they're calling you?
Well, it depends. If somebody said that we're going to give you something that's so phenomenal, as long as they're giving us something that's good. For instance, with TikTok as an example, we have the situation with TikTok where China will probably say, we'll approve a deal, but will you do something on the tariffs? The tariffs give us great power to negotiate.
All right, let's bring in Lindsay Gorman now. She's the managing director of the technology program at the German Marshall Fund. Lindsay, it's good to have you back on the day. Donald Trump has given TikTok another 75 days to find a non-Chinese buyer. Is he close to resolving this, do you think, or is he just kicking the can down the road?
Well, it's a little bit of both. I think it's important to note that this first 75-day extension was also illegal. The law that the U.S. Congress passed only allowed for the president to create an extension under pretty specific conditions about the progress towards a sale that weren't met then, and they haven't been met now. So it does sound like a deal is in the works. Whether that actually complies with the law in that it removes the national security concerns and actually is a legitimate divestment from the control of the People's Republic of China, I think is really the big question. We know that a deal can be made to satisfy TikTok, to satisfy ByteDance, to satisfy China, but can it satisfy U.S. national security concerns at the same time?
And if I understand you correctly, it sounds almost like that bipartisan vote in Congress last year didn't happen, or it doesn't matter to the president.
Absolutely. And I think this raises bigger questions about the separation of powers, the meaning of law. Generally, we probably a few months ago thought that the law of the land is the law of the land, and that's that. And I think it's really dangerous because this is what autocracies do. In autocratic systems like China, laws are just mere expressions of dictatorial intent. The president or the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party can just say, well, that doesn't really matter to me. This is what I want. Who cares if there's a law that says otherwise? And I fear that that's kind of what we're seeing with this TikTok law, that it's essentially being ignored, and a deal seems to be in the works that isn't really going to comply with that law. And we've already not been complying with the law. So from that perspective, I think maybe China has already scored a win.
And this week we've seen the president slapping tariffs on China, and he says that will induce Beijing to sell TikTok. But today, China retaliated by slapping its own tariffs on U.S. imports. And as we see tonight, TikTok is still Chinese. Is all of this the danger, in your opinion, of using ChatGPT to come up with policy?
Yeah, I think ignoring what, at least in the case of TikTok, was a long thought out process over many years. It's not like Congress woke up one day and said, let's create this law against TikTok. This was 5 years in the making. And yeah, it's being demolished with the stroke of a pen, or perhaps the input of a key into ChatGPT, as you say. And with the tariffs, it's almost like the Trump administration is trying to replace the cudgel that was U.S. law and the threat that TikTok would be banned if it didn't comply with these economic tariff means. And I just don't know if they're really going to work.
I heard someone earlier this evening say that if ByteDance were to sell TikTok but keep the algorithm. It would be like selling a car without the engine. I mean, how likely is it that ByteDance would agree to sell TikTok's core algorithm?
Yeah, that is the key. And it's not just about who owns the algorithm, but it's also about who controls it, who gets to display the content and make those choices. And that's what the algorithm is really doing. So of course the algorithm is a secret sauce, but that said, there are business transactions that happen, mergers and acquisitions that happen every day that involve very sophisticated and high-end intellectual property. So I think what we're asking for is not something unheard of. It's not like TikTok's algorithm is the only proprietary algorithm out there. It isn't totally uncharted territory.
Yeah.
The question is, will the Chinese government actually want to give up this amazing tool of leverage and potentially data espionage, not just on the US public, but the entire world? And that's where I think it is really a sticking point.
Yeah, there's all this focus on TikTok, but what about data transparency from other social media companies? I mean, why not focusing a little bit on Meta, for example?
Well, there's certainly tons of focus on Meta when it comes to data transparency. Meta, Google, all of the big tech companies obviously suction up lots of data. So US companies, Chinese companies, they're all collecting tons of data. The question is really, what are they doing with it and who has access to it? I hope we're not going to see the day where all of a sudden Meta is cooperating in lockstep with autocratic governments around the world, like China, like Russia. But that's exactly the situation with TikTok and ByteDance.
And let's hope the U.S. doesn't become an autocratic state itself in the future. Lindsay Gorman with the German Marshall Fund. Lindsay, we appreciate your time tonight. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.
All right, let's go now to our correspondent, Janelle Dumalaon. She is following this for us from Washington, D.C. Good to see you, Janelle. So, another 75 days, a new deadline. Was this expected?
Well, Brent, it was fairly expected. Now, ahead of today, President Trump was asked if he was open to extending the deadline for the ban or sale of TikTok. He said that if the deal wasn't finished, we would simply extend. It's not a big deal. So it's pretty clear that by the time we got today, we would either see an announcement of the beginnings of a deal where we don't know whether the Chinese would have gone for that or whether the can would continue to be kicked down the road. And as such, we heard today that the can was kicked down the road for another 75 days. Now, in his post on Truth Social, Trump said that he looked forward to working with TikTok and China in order to close a deal. That tells us that the approval of China is probably where the main sticking point is. In that same post, he also mentioned that the Chinese were probably not happy about the tariffs that he imposed on Chinese products. So that tells us that he's hoping to use tariffs as a sort of bargaining chip to bring China to the negotiating table when it comes to TikTok. That is his theory of the case. We, of course, don't know if that will work or not.
Janelle, the Chinese company that owns TikTok, ByteDance, it has repeatedly said that it has no plans to sell the app. Now, if they decide to do that, who would the potential buyers be?
There's a fairly long list of interested parties, Brent, so Amazon perhaps being the most high profile of them. They reportedly sent a letter to the Trump administration earlier this week expressing their interest, but nobody seems to think there's much of a future in that deal. There's also Oracle, there's also Microsoft, there's also an AI company called Perplexity, the private equity firm Blackstone. Elon Musk's name has been floated a few times, but he has said that he's not terribly interested in buying TikTok. There's also Mr. Beast, the famous YouTuber. There's also the owner of that adult entertainment platform, OnlyFans, Tim Stokely, as well as a consortium with Kevin O'Leary in it from TV Shark Tank, and the LA Dodgers owner Frank McCourt. So as you can see there, there's a fairly long list of interested suitors, but again, ByteDance has not publicly changed their position on whether they're willing to sell or not. They haven't said anything about whether they're in negotiations with anyone. So I guess we really have to see what the future of any kind of deal might look like.
Yeah, talk about a potpourri of possible buyers there. We know that the U.S. president has expressed a desire to help facilitate a deal and to preserve access to the platform. I'm wondering, Janelle, how long, though, can this process go on? I mean, how many times can he keep kicking the can down the road?
Well, you know, it was 75 the first time, it's 75 days the first time, it's 75 days the second time. I guess after 75 days, we'll know if it'll be 75 days the third time. But, you know, he does appear quite committed to yes, to seeing TikTok remain online in the U.S. And, you know, there have been talks of various middle ways between actually having TikTok sold or having to ban TikTok completely. One of them, of course, is having a U.S. company lease the algorithm from ByteDance. That's where ByteDance would still control the algorithm and have a minority stake, but a U.S. entity would sort of supervise it and make sure there aren't any backdoors where China could access the data of millions of American users. Now, there could be some issues with that. It might not be entirely compliant with a law that really clearly states that TikTok has to be sold or banned, but it just tells us how much Trump wants to see TikTok not go dark.
Okay, Janelle Dumalaon with the latest on the TikTok saga. Janelle, thank you. Well, for more, I'm joined now by Bondy Kaye. He's a research fellow at the School of Media and Communications at the University of Leeds. He's also the author of a book about TikTok from back in 2022. Bondy, it's good to have you with us. These negotiations, the search for a new owner, do we have any idea of why it's taking so long?
Thank you for having me. ByteDance has repeatedly said it has no intention to sell this platform, TikTok. 5 years ago, the Trump administration tried to force a sale, and at the time, representatives for ByteDance were quoted as saying that the company was committed to maintaining ownership of both the platform and the algorithmic recommender system that powers content recommendation on TikTok.
So if that's the case, if ByteDance is not going to part ways with TikTok, then why are we seeing yet another 75-day extension to do that?
It seems to be an obsession of the American administration to try and force a sale. And I do believe that if in some fashion a sale can be agreed or a deal can be reached, it might satisfy U.S. lawmakers. But it would be like selling a car without the engine if TikTok were to be sold without the algorithmic recommender system that powers it, which does speak to the value, both culturally, economically, and politically, of algorithmic recommendation technology at this moment in time.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, could there be a deal where U.S. investors take over TikTok, but ByteDance retains the algorithm? Would that satisfy U.S. lawmakers, do you think?
It's possible. I do think that the company has, made it clear that they are very unwilling to sell the algorithmic recommendation system, but they may indeed reach a deal to sell the company to some U.S. tech companies. But again, looking at how this played out 5 years ago, the Chinese government even tightened export controls to help to prevent the sale of algorithmic recommender systems because they seem to understand the value of this technology. Yeah,
I was going to say, I mean, certainly members of Congress realize that the TikTok algorithm is TikTok, right? And so if you buy the app and you don't have the algorithm, as you say, you've got a car without an engine.
That's right. And that may be enough to satisfy the Congress. We've seen in past years there's perhaps limited understanding in some instances when it comes to these digital platforms. We've had hearings about whether or not Facebook is profitable, even though they run an advertising model. So it's really unclear to what extent the U.S. Congress is interested in.
Okay, well,
the whole package.
Let's imagine then that we are members of the U.S. Congress, and then imagine that we're going to convince ByteDance to sell TikTok. I mean, who would be the most likely buyers, do you think? I mean, I've seen names such as Oracle, Amazon, even Mr. Beast.
That's right. My guess, if I had to guess one, would be Oracle. Again, once more going back to 2020, President Trump had supported a deal in which Oracle and the U.S. retailer Walmart would become minority stakeholders of TikTok, but ByteDance would maintain majority control. That deal never went through, but this time around we see Oracle once again in the running, but no sign of Walmart. And I understand that the Trump administration maintains some ties with Oracle CEO. So if I had to pick one, my guess would probably be them.
Okay, I've got 30 seconds. Let me ask you, the alternative to a deal then is a ban. How would that affect the millions of Americans who use TikTok? Would they be in withdrawal?
Possibly. We've already seen the effect when this happened in January. TikTok went dark for a few days, or no, for one day, sorry. And people were making peace with their audiences. They were going to other places like Instagram or another Chinese short video app, Xiaohongshu. I mean, it's not unprecedented that this could happen, but I think people would be looking for something else.
It could happen, as you say. That is true. Bondy, Kaye, we appreciate you taking the time on this Friday to help us understand the future of TikTok. Thank you.
Thank you so much.